Get that going. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Chris Barney with the Sonoma County Transportation Authority. So very happy to have you all with us this afternoon to roll out the Sonoma County VMT Mitigation and Reduction Calculator. So we've been working on this over the last year or so. So very excited to be able to have the tool available and to present the tool to you today. So with that, let me go ahead and get my screen shared. So since we're quite a large group today, I'm not going to go around the room and do introductions, but again, I will just introduce myself, Chris Barney with Sonoma County Transportation Authority, and the team from Fair and Peers. We have Julie Morgan and Drew Levitt on the call as well that have been working on this with our consultant group from Fair and Peers. So very happy to have them here today and are looking forward to hearing from them, especially Drew, as we go through the demonstration of the tool. So for today, we're going to be talking briefly about the project purpose and a little bit of background on Senate Bill 743 and vehicle miles traveled, and then diving into the meat of the meeting today, which is looking at the tool, getting a quick overview of the tool, and then diving into the demonstration where you can see the tool as it looks now, and a few walkthrough examples of how to use the tool. After that, we'll go ahead and open things up for a question and answer period. And the tool is available on the Scta website right now. So later in the presentation, I have a link for that. And after I work through the introduction, I can go ahead and drop that into the chat box as well. So this project was begun to help with Senate Bill 743 implementation. So today I'll be talking a little bit about what Senate Bill 743 is. So I'm guessing that most of you that are on this call or are part of this meeting know a little bit about what Senate Bill 743 is and are working on implementing it right now. Be talking a little bit about how SCTA is supporting you as you implement the requirements of SB 743, talking a little bit about VMT and specifically what types of VMT need to be calculated and analyzed as part of SB 743 implementation, and then talking about walking through the analysis process for different projects. So Senate Bill 743 is a bill that changes how transportation impacts are considered in CEQA. So previously, level of service or congestion was used to measure transportation impacts. SB 743 requires that transportation impacts are analyzed using other measures. The state tasked the Governor's Office of Planning and Research with finding a new metric, and they recommended VMT, or vehicle miles traveled, as the metric that should be used for analyzing transportation impacts under CEQA. So the bill has been out there for a number of years, and the implementation deadline was July 1st, 2020. So the requirement has been out there for a couple years now. SCTA isn't a lead agency, so we don't set thresholds or draft travel analysis guidelines, but we do provide technical support as you at the local jurisdiction level are implementing SB 743. So the types of things that we're able to do are, providing information and education on the bill itself and requirements, producing screening maps showing high and low VMT areas, producing VMT data and estimates using the Sonoma County travel model and Sonoma County travel behavior study, I did just mention the Sonoma County Travel Behavior Study. So this is a mobile source or big data study that we also worked with Fair and Peers on that provides a wealth of information on origins and destinations and other travel statistics that can also be helpful when analyzing VMT and implementing SB 743. We're able to use the travel model and other resources to conduct project level VMT analysis or provide tools for consultants to do that. And then today we're actually introducing the VMT Mitigation and Reduction Calculator, which is another way that we're supporting you as you implement SB 743. So VMT is at the heart of SB 743 implementation. So just to provide a really high level definition of what that is at its simplest terms, it is number of trips times the distance of those trips. And it measures the total amount of travel happening in an area, not just looking at bottlenecks and congested areas. So it's a measure of total travel and transportation activity, not congestion. And it really looks at the big picture of transportation. So when analyzing and implementing SB 743, VMT is usually segmented in a few different ways, outlined here on this slide. So one way of looking at VMT is home-based VMT, and this is looking at travel to and from a home. So going to work, going to school, things like that. So any travel that's associated with leaving your home or coming back is home-based travel. And in an SB 743 context, this is typically used to look at residential projects. Work VMT or commute VMT is any travel associated with traveling to and from work. So pretty simple. Generally, there are 2 trips to and from work each day. So, and this type of VMT is typically used to analyze office and employment-related projects. And then you can look at total VMT, which is all the travel, all the VMT happening in a specific area associated with a specific project. So here's a more detailed way of looking at how that VMT can be broken down. So this is a sample of someone's travel during a day. So you can see a home in the center, pretty small home, a workplace location, which is the blue building, a shopping center, and then a coffee shop. So you can see a trip to and from work. Those are trips 1 and 2. These would both be home-based work trips. So these would be it would be associated with work VMT, but also home-based VMT. Then you can see a trip to the coffee shop. This would be a home-based trip as well. But after the trip to the coffee shop, you see a trip from the coffee shop to a shopping center. So this is a type of travel that's not ending or beginning at the home. So this would be omitted from that home-based VMT. And then finally, you see a trip from the shopping center back home. So again, this is home-based VMT. So that would be included in that umbrella home-based VMT category. And then looking at total VMT, you would look at all the VMT from all these trips in a specific area. So when analyzing projects for VMT, there are 4 rough questions to ask or steps that should be taken. The first is to determine if VMT impacts need to be analyzed and look at project-based screening. So OPR has proposed different project screening criteria associated with project size, project type. There are pre-screened low VMT areas that you can see in maps that SCTA and other organizations have prepared. And then local jurisdictions can also set other locally identified screening criteria as long as they can back those up with significant research and evidence. So if you've looked at your project and have determined that VMT impacts do need to be analyzed, the next step is to calculate the VMT for that project. So, and determine how much VMT is happening and can be associated with that. There are a number of different ways of doing this. One is to use a travel model to plug it in and look at the reports, and that'll give you VMT estimates. You can also use trip generation and trip lengths, either from a travel model or travel survey, to estimate your VMT. And there are also a number of different spreadsheet-based or sketch VMT estimators out there that use simple formulas to calculate VMT for different project types. So this is pretty standard practice when preparing a traffic study for a project. The next step is, once you have a VMT estimate, is to look at thresholds and determine if there is an impact. The thresholds are set by a local agency. OPR is recommended different thresholds for residential, retail, and office projects. And for uses not covered under those three broad categories, they recommend you find something, you use one of those recommendations that's close to the project type that you're looking at, and transfer their recommendations to that project type. So if you look at the thresholds and it does look like your project does have an impact, that's where you'll need to look at and consider mitigation. And this is where the Sonoma County VMT Reduction Mitigation Calculator is helpful. It will help you quantify the effectiveness of different mitigation measures based on where the project is and what types of mitigations you select. So the VMT mitigation calculator estimates the effectiveness of mitigation. Like I said, it's tied to the project type and location. You basically enter in a traffic analysis zone in the tool, and it will automatically populate some background information from the travel model into the tool. And the quantification of the effectiveness of mitigation is largely based on information from the CAPCOA 2021 update that you can see here, the handbook for analyzing greenhouse gas emission reductions, and so forth. So there's a wealth of information on GHG and VMT reduction in this handbook, and additional resources and research is also referenced both in the tool and in the documentation. So with that, I'll go ahead and turn things over to Drew to give us a brief overview of the tool, and then we'll dive into a demonstration.
Thanks very much, Chris. We head to the next slide, if you'd be so kind. So in developing this tool, we wanted to build off of prior art. So the Sandag and San Diego had a VMT reduction calculator, which we at Fair and Peers built on to create a tool for the Alameda CTC. We also have our own so-called TDM Plus tool. We, early in the process here with Scta, did a deep dive into those existing tools and compared their strengths and limitations. We, through the steering committee and through a number of conversations as well, heard about the local priorities, strategies that folks really wanted to make sure were included in the tool, policy questions that were specific to Sonoma County as well. And we've gotten a variety of valuable feedback through a series of conversations over the course of this process. And so with that feedback in hand, then the next task was to adapt TDM Plus and customize it to Sonoma County. So that included bringing in information from the Scta model about trip distances and mode shares and other local data. Then, work out all the bugs, test, send a draft, retest, and we're pleased to be here with the final tool in hand. Also in hand, and I know Chris has these materials and I believe is going to post them on the TA's website, are some supporting documentation. So there's a design document that provides a little bit more detail about all of the strategies included in the tool, as well as the tool's overall design purpose, caveats and so forth. And Chris, are you also going to post, so we developed also a draft kind of project worksheet that looks at the rest of that process that Chris kind of outlined.
Yep.
Is that going on the Scta website as well?
Yeah, we'll post that as well, an update.
Great.
Yeah, as it's updated. Yep.
Yeah. So, a range of supporting materials. I'd also note the CAPCOA manual that Chris just referred to is available on the web as well, and is linked to from the supporting documentation. Next slide, Chris, please.
Yep.
Right. So again, where it comes to CEQA, the critical phrase is substantial evidence. So this VMT reduction calculator is intended to help you all implement and realize the requirements of SB 743. And in order for that to work, the VMT reduction calculations that the tool produces must be supported by substantial evidence. So all of the strategies included in the tool are based on a body of research literature that is meaningful, usually more than one study. Optimally, these are studies of real world situations. Some of the strategies are based on studies of travel models, but for the most part, these are based on real world observed data, which is really helpful. And these are sets of research literature that have, we feel, proven to be substantial evidence in other contexts where we've applied tools like these. Unfortunately, this does mean that certain strategies that the Sonoma community might want, some of them are and some of them are not quantified by this substantial evidence. So we've done our best to include the strategies that folks wanted, but if a strategy is not in the tool, it is generally speaking because the evidence isn't there yet. The hope with all of these VMT tools is that as the research literature continues to evolve, that we can periodically revisit the state of the practice and gradually incorporate additional strategies. In addition to providing substantial evidence, the tool is sort of self-documenting. You'll see in the demo that each strategy includes a list of citations to that body of research literature. So it's right there for you, which can help the defensibility of the findings. We also, as I mentioned, incorporated data from the Scta county travel model. So when you use the tool, basically the first step will be to identify which transportation analysis zone your project is in. And then based on that, it pulls the local data from the model. So can help, in some cases, certain strategies, effectiveness vary based on local trip distances and mode shares. And so that just comes in. And yeah, so what we're delivering today hopefully will be of good use to as many folks as possible in Sonoma County for years to come. The practice does evolve, however. We are Chris has a password and can unlock the tool and can make modifications from time to time. And again, as the research literature evolves, perhaps this is a conversation that can be ongoing, and periodically we can add in new strategies. So what strategies are there in there? There are 5 broad buckets of strategies amounting to a total of, actually, let me tally it up really quickly. It's somewhere in the low to mid 20s of strategies. Yep, we have actually 32 strategies. Hey, that's great. An extra dozen strategies free of charge. So there are strategies related to the land use program of the project itself. The literature indicate that the residential or employment density of a project is associated with different VMT per capita. There's also one having to do with transit-oriented development. Obviously, the location of the project is of paramount importance there. The literature also indicates that incorporating below market rate housing into projects can tend to decrease VMT as well. And then there are measures as well having to do with improving the connectivity of the street network, which typically might involve taking, large sort of super blocks and making them a bit more permeable, a bit more supportive specifically to walking and other kinds of non-motorized transportation. Then there are a bunch of commute trip reduction programs, including 2 all-inclusive measures, a voluntary or a mandatory all-inclusive commute trip reduction program. But if you don't want to do a all-in-one package, then we break that out. And so you can look at specifically commute trip reduction marketing to employees at a site, rideshare programs, van pool, subsidized or discounted transit. And this one, we wanted to make sure, typically subsidized transit is an employment concern. And so typically it's for work trips, but there is a world in which, you might have a mixed use development or residential development where perhaps, let's say it's rental units, and with the lease, you get some sort of monthly subsidy for transit. So we wanted to incorporate a strategy that would allow a transit subsidy to apply to both employment and non-employee trips. Bike parking, that's an end of trip bicycle facilities means, and then parking pricing as well. So there's a couple of parking pricing measures. One is simply to price the the parking spaces at the workplace. And then the other is parking cash out, which is functionally similar, but it's sort of the inverse, where instead of charging employees for parking on site, you instead offer employees the opportunity to forego on-site parking and to receive some sort of cash compensation on a regular basis in return. And then finally, there is community-based travel planning, which can apply in an employment, in a work or residential context as well. And that is similar to commute trip reduction marketing. That's largely a question of making folks aware of the range of travel options available to them. A couple other parking and roadway pricing or management strategies to talk about. In a residential project context, one might seek to limit the supply of parking at residences. Not to get into planning details, but obviously, this will depend on jurisdictions' positions vis-a-vis parking minimums. But if generally speaking, the literature indicates that if less parking is provided, then that essentially it makes it harder to find a parking space if you live there, and then that can help deter driving. That's sort of the general premise. Sort of similar, a softer measure perhaps has to do with unbundling the cost of parking from the property. So in a condo context, for example, or not, say an apartment building, right? You might have a lease on the residential unit, but instead of having one parking space or two parking spaces per unit bundled into that lease, you might have a separate fee for the parking. That would allow folks who use no or less parking to pay for no or less parking and make that relatively attractive. And then similarly, there's an on-street parking pricing measure as well. And we'll see in the demo that you have to be careful about the contexts in which you apply some of those measures. Like, you have to make sure if you are going to charge for parking at the workplace or parking at the home, that's only going to work if there isn't free or low cost parking abundantly nearby, right? If folks can park just across the street, the strategy sort of loses its mojo. Let's go on to the next slide, Chris.
Hey,
right.
Chris or Drew, is it okay to ask questions, or are you just wanting to hold off on our questions?
Drew, are you okay answering a question now, or should we hold those to the end?
Sure, I'll take a question. Yeah.
Yeah. So this actually came up with a conversation with one of our planners here last week about a VMT requirement as it relates to like ADUs. So how does that fit into that last slide where you talk about land use and increasing density? So I guess the question is how does it address ADUs? Will this calculator, or does it?
That's a good question. That feels to me like something of an evolving policy realm. I mean, certainly if you had a residential neighborhood and then you added a bunch of ADUs to that neighborhood, the density of that neighborhood would increase. But each individual ADU would presumably be too small of a project, and you probably wouldn't be getting into this level of review in the first place. I presume you have some sort of district-wide ADU policy in mind.
Well, right, but it's actually the ADUs would be part of the development, not with existing property owners. So it would come in as part of a development application where they're proposing densities plus single family plus ADUs, right? So it's a different question.
Got it. Okay, well in that case then I would think you would express that via the increased residential density strategy, just plain and simple. You'd sort of consider the aggregate residential density of the primary and the accessory dwelling units on all of the parcels in the development.
And maybe I'll just add to that, Drew, that is with the caveat or with the understanding, as in several of these measures, and Drew may get into this in some of the demos, but residential density is an example of a measure where there is kind of a floor of density, and you have to at least get to that floor before an increase in density will start to have a VMT effect. And I believe that floor is around 9 dwelling units per acre. So it will matter if your sort of primary plus accessory dwelling unit combined density is still lower than that floor, then there would be no VMT effects that would come, at least from this tool. But if it then pushed it above that floor, then there would be some effect.
Great point, Julie.
Okay, I'm going to go back to the next slide here, unless there are any other questions.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks, Nancy, for that question. Yeah, so last two buckets of strategies included in the tool. Many of these are actually strategies that reduce VMT associated with the project, but also in the broader neighborhood or community within which the project is located. So an example of that, provide pedestrian network improvements. That looks like increasing the number of miles of sidewalks and other pedestrian facilities in a given vicinity. Bike facility improvement and the constructor improved bike boulevard have to do with implementing either a single facility or bike boulevard, or actually there's an expand bikeway network strategy as well, which includes multiple facilities on multiple roadways. Again, obviously the premise is that, if a project's VMT reduction strategy suite includes these strategies, the residents and employees at that project would benefit, but so would the broader community with improved walkability and bikeability. Similarly, yeah, car share, there are a variety of things that one might share to enable folks to live a more car-light lifestyle. That includes cars, that includes bikes, both electric and non-electric. The only difference between those two measures, the non-electric and electric bike share, is actually that there's good reason to assume a higher average trip length for electric bike share than for non-electric bike share, because I don't know if you all have ever ridden e-bikes, but it's much easier and a lot more fun than riding an ordinary bike. And so that's reflected in the strategy. And finally, of course, scooter share, which, those are electric assist scooters as well. So some of the magnitudes of effect of some of those kind of new mobility option strategies are relatively small, as we may see. Over on the transit side, there are a variety of things that one can do to make the transit system in the vicinity of the project help more people get where they need to go when they need to go in a timely fashion. So that might look like extending the hours of the day during which the transit network is running, is active. That might look like increasing the geographic reach of the transit network. That might look like improving the frequency of service on one or more routes of the network. That might look like transit supportive roadway treatments. So transit only lanes, higher quality bus shelters, queue jumps, and kind of other treatments that help transit vehicles travel quickly and help folks take transit comfortably. Associated with that is bus rapid transit as a holistic package. So that typically involves dedicated rights of way. Usually you also will have off-board fare collection, ideally level boarding and so forth. And so that's the idea there, is to achieve some of the comforts and effectivenesses of rail transit, but with a rubber-tired vehicle instead. And then finally, sort of similar to the transit subsidy we saw before, instead of subsidizing transit ridership for the users of a project, you might instead reduce transit fares in general. You might make a contribution to allow the transit agency to reduce its fares. And similarly, the premise there, if transit is cheaper, maybe more folks will take it. So those are the strategies that are in the tool. I guess we can go on to the next slide, Chris. Right, which is a chance to see the tool in action. So I'm going to actually demonstrate the use of the tool on two hypothetical projects. Before I do that, though, first of all, oh great, I can share my screen. Thank you for that, Chris. Before I do that, maybe now is a good moment to pause and see if there are any questions on the slides that we just discussed.
I'm not seeing any raised hands.
Neither am I. All right, well, no questions is good questions. Questions is also good questions, though. So folks, if things occur to folks partway through, please do chime in. Let me share my screen then, and hopefully I can get this set up such that I can still see the chat. That is what I'm going to try to do. All right, can people see my screen?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Mm-hmm. Excellent. That's good, because I cannot. My computer is like flipping out. Okay, well,
now it's black. Now we just see black.
Now it's black. Me and Zoom,
Ah, there. Now it's back.
Okay. Okay. I am screen sharing, hopefully. My computer is really struggling. All right. Hopefully, hopefully folks can see this. I don't know what I'm going to do about this. All right, so I have it up on the introduction page. I do want to highlight that first. And the reason there is that it contains sort of background info, similar to what we've just discussed on this call about the purpose and the reasons why you might use this VMT reduction calculator. Do want to note the disclaimers as well that, and we'll see this in practice in a second if my computer will stop doing what it's doing. The main disclaimer that I do want to make clear is that this tool is not a replacement for reasoned judgment on the part of the planner or the project sponsor. So not every strategy is going to be applicable in every context. The range of inputs that are reasonable for a given strategy are going to vary based on the local context as well. The data we tried to include are as accurate as possible and come out of the Scta model. In certain cases, it's possible to actually override the default data, but generally you should not do so unless you have a good reason to do so. I actually need to see what I can do because my computer is caught in a sort of loop.
Brew, do you want me to try and share the calculator? And
you know, that would be good. Yeah,
okay.
Yeah.
If you want to stop sharing, I'll try and bring it up and just
sounds good. Yeah. Yeah, that sounds good. Thanks for that, Chris. Okay. I don't know, just having a bad computer day. Thanks for sharing that. Great. Yeah. So introduction tab we sort of basically talked about, but the overview is worth reading. It's all worth reading. Everything is here for a reason. There's an FAQ down below the disclaimers if these are questions that we have typically fielded. So take a look if you need to, but hopefully most of the tool, as I say, is self-documenting. But if you do have questions, this is a good place to come. That or the design document, which contains a version of this FAQ. Let's go to the main tab and we can talk about this. So what you see, there's some instructions up top. They're pretty short. The premise is that you start by defining certain project characteristics, of which the most important is its location, in terms of which TAZ it's in. And then the legend is helpful too. So the green cells are ones where you must provide an input in order to use a given strategy. Orange ones are optional inputs. So there's a default value that comes typically out of the Scta model. But if it is something that you have better data for, you can override that. And in general, this worksheet is actually locked such that only the green and orange cells are available to interact with. So hopefully the formulas in the tool won't break as a result. Yeah, so I had a couple of project concepts in mind. So the first step, as I say, is understanding where your project is in terms of TAZs. So there's a link actually you can click that opens up a web map that shows the TAZs of Sonoma County. So yeah, you can click that link, Chris, and it's a pretty straightforward web map. Is that loading up?
Yeah, let me share my entire screen.
Oh, right, yeah.
All right.
Perfect. Yeah, there it is. Great. So, yeah, you zoom in, it actually labels the TAZs. You can see those. And it gives you an idea of their scale as well. Like in the denser parts of the county, a TAZ might be just a handful of blocks, and elsewhere in the county, TAZs can be large to very large. So I said, and I want to be clear, both of these projects are utterly hypothetical. I am several things, including a planner, but I am by no means a developer. So these are, there's nothing behind these. Let's say, first of all, that we wanted to consider an office park in somewhere in northeast Petaluma. So I would go over to Petaluma and I said, well, TAZ 270, which is one of the ones kind of a little bit further northwest from where your cursor is. Yeah, so there's 270 kind of on the edge of Petaluma. And so that seemed like a reasonable place. Let's say we're going to construct an office project there. So I said, all right, great, TAZ 270. And I went back to the tool. And if you type 270 into there, you can, you scroll down or type just the stuff. Yep. And when you hit that, you press enter, I suppose. Great. So then it confirms the project's, the TAZ's place type. The jurisdiction, it does say Sonoma County. This is because the TAZ, as indicated on the web map, incidentally, it straddles the Petaluma-Sonoma County border. And it also will note here, this project is not in a transit-oriented development location. And that's just a question of it's just not close to any transit stops with at least 15-minute service every 15 minutes. You can, if you wish, enter a project name, address, and type. It's cosmetic though. It shows up on the results tab, but yeah, that's where somebody can do that. But yeah, let's say we have this office project and we've gone through the rest of the SB 743 workflow and we find that there would be a significant VMT impact. So we're going to use this calculator to try to identify a slate of VMT reduction strategies that would mitigate that to less than significant. The first thing we might do is I would go to T2, increase job density. And I say, well, I happen to know that while the typical job density of a typical development is 145 jobs per acre, well, I know because I planned this project site, this is going to be 175 jobs per acre. So that's above the average density, and I'd like credit for that. So entering that, I can see, okay, all right, I'm looking at about a 1.5% reduction in VMT because of that land use characteristic of my project. Not bad, but let's say that isn't going to be enough to mitigate my impact. Then, because this is kind of an employment site, I'm probably going to focus mostly on strategies that reduce employee commute trips. So, all right, I've heard good things about commute trip reduction programs. I'm going to go over to T5, the Voluntary Commute Trip Reduction Program. And T6 is the mandatory. Let's say, though, I don't actually want to make my commute trip reductions mandatory. That feels a little draconian. So I'm going to say, yeah, all of my employees here are eligible for a commute trip or for this commute trip reduction program. And again, this is going to be an all-inclusive one that encompasses measures like ride sharing, van pool, and so forth. So, all right, so this employee commute trip reduction program might reduce my VMT by about 4%. So great. Well, let's say I'm interested in a couple other measures as well. Maybe I'm thinking about pricing the parking at my workplace. So that is going to be T12. So I'm thinking to myself, all right, what if I were to price the parking here? But wait, now this is where I really need to put on my thinking cap and say, what are the characteristics of the area around my site? Maybe I think that this sort of location on the edge of Petaluma maybe isn't actually suitable for this. There's a sense in which there might be abundant parking nearby, and as such, pricing the parking on my project site is not going to be effective. Folks are just going to park right across the street. So here's where, as tempting as it might be to increase the parking or to implement pricing of parking, a reasoned approach to the site might indicate that this one perhaps won't be available. That's okay. Let's consider some other strategies. So maybe I have heard that people may wish to bike to work, and so I'm going to go to T10, which is the bike parking end of trip bicycle facilities. And I say, what, sure. So there's a couple ways. There's like a low touch and a high touch kind of bike parking that you could provide. So if I click in that cell, I can actually see what the options are. So I could provide just bike parking, indoor bike parking, secure bike parking, so that folks don't get their bikes stolen, right? Nobody likes that. Or I could go above and beyond. And in addition to the parking, I might provide showers and bike lockers, personal lockers, the kind of amenities that make it possible for folks to, bike a greater distance or just increase the flexibility and the comfort of bike commuting. So I'll say, yeah, you know what? Like we'll do that. We'll have a whole bike room. We'll have showers. We'll have a work stand and what have you. So then, you can see here in the orange cells, this strategy has actually pulled in some data from the Scta model, and notes, what is the bike commute mode share and the drive commute mode share in the vicinity of the project. What's the average bike trip length and car trip length for all the trips in the region. Those are all, again, coming out of the Scta model. And so we see, all right, well, great. So if we were to provide high quality bike parking facilities at this office project, we'd be looking at about a 2% reduction in VMT. So maybe let's try one more strategy as well. We think, well, how about van pooling? So if we go to T11, which is employer-sponsored van pool, we see, okay, well, the key input here is what share of employees are going to participate in a van pool program. And, van pools are tricky. And I'll just note that in practice, they tend to be used mostly by workers groups of workers coming from fairly far away. Otherwise, closer in, you're usually talking more about carpooling than van pooling. That's why, by the way, that the default average van pool commute trip length is as high as it is. That was from a study that Sandag did. But keep bearing in mind what we feel we know about van pooling, which can evolve. If van pool programs become more prevalent in Sonoma County, there may be some local data that can refine this strategy. But let's say only 5% of our employees are going to participate in the van pool program. That's going to reduce VMT by about 3%. And that reflects the fact that 5% of employees are, coming from a ways away, but their VMT doesn't disappear entirely because obviously the van is making this trip. All right, so we've got 4 strategies that we've configured, and we thought about and rejected a 5th strategy. So let's go to results now and kind of see how we're doing. And wait a second, okay, hold on, there's a problem. I see the C strategy conflicts, and if we scroll down somewhat, we might see even a little bit further. Yeah, suddenly we see, wait a second, oh shoot, there's some conflicts. So what's happened here? Well, we picked some strategies that are in conflict. Maybe we might be double counting something here. So what we can do is up at the top of the results page where it said C conflict info or C strategy conflicts, that'll take us to the conflict info tab. And this explains first what's going on and second what we might do about it. So the deal is that sometimes some strategies cannot be implemented in tandem. The example we provide here is you certainly can't have both a mandatory and a voluntary commute trip reduction program. The specific problem that seems to be happening here is that we've chosen an all-inclusive voluntary commute trip reduction program, but we've also specified details for a couple of strategies that are typically seen as part of that all-inclusive strategy. So the way to resolve conflicts is to take a look at the conflict detail description and see what are the conflicts. And so we can see that the voluntary commute trip reduction program conflicts with bike parking and conflicts with the van pool. And the way to resolve that is to pick one or another of the strategies and remove its inputs such that it is no longer calculating a VMT reduction. And then at that point, the strategy's effects will be included in results, whereas currently they're excluded. So maybe what we'll do is we'll say, honestly, maybe we feel like the bike parking and the van pool are the most important components of the commute trip reduction program anyway, and so we don't need to separately talk about this voluntary program. So let's go back to T5 and say, you know what, forget it. Let's just, so we can either set that at 0 or you can just delete the contents of that cell. And you can see the change in VMT has disappeared. And now when we go back to the results tab, we will see the text of go to results has now disappeared. And we do see there is an aggregate VMT reduction associated with trip reduction programs. And that is the 4.9% there. So let's scroll down a little bit more. I do think that there may be.
So one thing to point out too, this is a good page to check and see if you have anything left over. I had this open before and had entered in residential density. So probably want to take that out for an office project.
Yeah, I saw that. I was thinking, what's going on there? So,
Yeah.
Right. Great. Yeah. So there ultimately the 3 remaining strategies. We reduced all project generated trips by 1.5%, and that came from the relatively higher employment density relative to the average project employment density. And then the bike parking and the van pool measure in total reduced employee commute trips specifically by about another 5%. And so this is now these 2 reductions here in like the high level summary table. This is something that we can say, okay, well, let's look, what share of the project VMT is employee commute trips. And because this is an office park, it's probably pretty close to 100%. So you're going to apply both the 4.9% employee commute trip reduction and the 1.5% all project trips reduction to that pot of commute VMT. So in total, we're probably talking about something in the range of like 6 to 6.5% reduction in VMT relative to the same project without the VMT reduction strategies. And so then the final step would be, again, back in the project worksheet or in whatever other analytical frame you're working within, to take a look and say, does this suite of strategies reduce VMT enough such that the VMT impact is no longer significant? And let's assume for the sake of argument that it does, and say, well, great, we got there. So that's the example that I had in mind for kind of an office and a more employment-focused example project. Any questions or thoughts on the process we just discussed? I see Joanne, you raised your hand.
Hi, yeah, thanks. Way back in the beginning, and I'm new to this tool, so forgive me if you've covered it. You had said trip reduction, you had said transit-oriented land use. There's a thing you can click on that. And I just was wondering if you could clarify. Yeah, there it was. There, I saw it for a second. There it is.
Yes, great.
Project in a transit-oriented development location. You had said 15-minute headways. Is that the threshold for that? Can that be adjusted? Because of SMART's commuter rail service is 30-minute headways, and honestly, commuter rail should never be more frequent than that. But it has a really strong impact on reduction in vehicle miles traveled. So.
Yeah, Joanne, thank you for that. And sorry, I should clarify the criteria for the transit service on which TOD can depend are either rail transit or transit service of any technology with 15-minute or better headways. So for sure, yeah, I mean, the basically how it crumbles in the Sonoma context is that those TAZs that are near smart stations are in transit-oriented development locations, and more or less those that aren't.
And is that and what is the distance for the TAZs around that station?
Half a mile as the crow flies.
And is that set by us, or is it set by somebody else?
That comes from the research literature. That's the typical definition of a TOD context in the literature.
Okay. The Federal Transit Administration views pedestrian projects within 1 mile of a transit station and bicycle projects within 3 miles of a transit station, like a rail station, to be de facto part of the transit project. So they must be working with different data to indicate that they want to stretch that limit, but we might want to explore that a little more.
Well, I think Scta, Chris is far more knowledgeable, or maybe Drew, but I think Scta has the limits as part of the.
Yeah, it's part of the OPR guidance.
Yeah.
Yeah. So this is all Scta VMT focused definitions, Joanne.
There's a continued disconnect on the various distances from all the oversight agencies. So like a lot of different grant programs are using different thresholds as well, but I got it.
Yep.
Yeah, not to speculate too much, but it may be the case that there's a distinction drawn between land use projects. Like land use developments that are specifically oriented toward the transit station. Like your classic TOD is for all intents and purposes, like on top of or adjacent to the station. So that versus more transportation projects like bike or pedestrian network improvements, like you mentioned, which could be seen as sort of station access improvements, but might have a wider catchment area. That said, I'm not expert in the FTA's guidance on grant eligibility, for station access projects. But thank you for your question and for particularly for the opportunity to clarify the TOD eligibility criteria that the tool includes. Any other questions about this first example? Hearing none, I might suggest that we consider a second example. So I thought, let's do an office thing, let's do a residential thing as well. So I said, let's imagine a housing development just south of Healdsburg or on the edge of Healdsburg. So the TAZ that I found that seemed reasonable is TAZ 879. And we might want to jump to the map for a second and actually just kind of like can look at the network context, if that makes sense. Yeah, so 879 is kind of the big jagged one around the Veterans Memorial Beach there. And again, this is all fabricated from whole cloth. But let's say we wanted to build a residential development there consisting of a mixture of single family and multifamily dwellings, right? And we're going to say that there's approximately 250 dwelling units in total. Fabulous. So we got our Healdsburg test project. We're going residential for sure, and we're going to go to TAZ 879. Cool. Yep, and you can see it's in a suburban place type. This time it's in Healdsburg. Still not adjacent to SMART, but I promise you that there are TAZs that are adjacent to SMART. These just aren't those. Let's say here that the overall density of this particular development is not above the average residential density. So we're not going to try to claim credit for that, but we are going to incorporate a certain share of below market rate units. So we can go to T4, the integrate affordable and below market rate housing. And let's say that we're going to say 20% of our units are going to be below market rate. So the effect there might be a 5 or 6% reduction in VMT. This is what the literature tells us. Now, let's also think about what else we might do. So let's say we want to limit parking at the site. So this is going to be T15, which is the limit residential parking supply. And so let's say let's say parking demand is 300 parking spaces, but we're only going to supply 200 parking spaces. And then finally, we have to say, well, what share of project VMT is generated by residents? In this case, this is not a mixed use project. It's just going to be 100%, right? And then let's leave the commute-based household VMT assumption in place. That's typical from the research literature. And what it tells us is that this particular provision of parking might reduce the project VMT by between 4 and 5%. And again, we would want to be thoughtful about this. And I tried to pick a TAZ in which this strategy might be effective. But again, I do want to caution with every strategy, but particularly with the parking pricing and parking reduction strategies, sensitivity to the local context is very important. Joanne, I see you raise your hand.
Hi, is it not near a smart station because the smart station isn't operating there yet? Is that why?
Presumably, yes.
Yeah,
okay.
We can change that when that comes online, Joanne. And I think the other project may have been near the North Petaluma station as well. So yeah, that's something we can definitely update as things change.
Yeah, I guess I'm just wondering how you're going to handle evaluating projects that are somehow incorporated with bringing the smart station online. Like if you did a transit-oriented development project, then you would you have the ability to go in and add the smart service in for the evaluation tool?
Yeah, I would say probably
integrated.
Right, yeah. In that case, probably the best bet. So Chris, again, is able to unlock and manipulate the tool. And so Chris could go into the internals and just toggle the near transit flag for that particular TAZ, toggle that on to true. And then you'd be able to kind of go from there.
And, one thing I would note is that the tool really does need to be interpreted and analyzed by whoever's, the traffic engineer or planner that's actually preparing the traffic study or doing the VMT analysis. The tool will help you quantify a lot of this, but if you have other ideas, this will just get you part of the way there, and it'll help you with that final analysis.
That's right. I think Einstein said it best when he may or may not have actually said everything should be made as simple as possible, but not simpler. So we've tried to include as much useful information as possible, but some of the most useful information may be the citations to the literature itself, as well as the references to the CAPCOA handbook. So you can kind of get into the primary sources and consider their implications. Nancy.
Oh yeah, I was gonna bring this up later, but Chris brought it up. So there's a lot of city and local staff on this call, and we're actually not the ones that will probably be doing these analysis. It's going to be consultants. So just a broad general question on how this is going to be outreach to the traffic engineering consultants who will probably be doing this work. It's good for us to know and mind you, but I don't think so. That's just a general question.
Yeah, Nancy, thanks for that. We have posted it to our website. We're just took a brief announcement at our committees, and we'll be taking it to our board. So we're doing a little outreach that way. And as far as the getting the word out to the consultants, a lot of them are actually kind of clued in already on what we're doing, but we're reliant on you at the local level. If you have a consultant that's preparing a traffic study and you want them to be able to quantify mitigations, please point them towards this tool and let them know it's out there. So I know some of the consultants and some developers will contact us for information, but you guys really are the lead agencies, and it's kind of your purview to decide what you want to recommend people use and get them pointed to the right direction. So hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, I appreciate that. I know there's a lot of people new to the call, so having that may be the first time you've heard that. So I appreciate you sharing that info to all of us, Chris.
Yeah, and please, if you have a SB 743 implementation or VMT website or traffic study manual or guide, please feel free to link the site on our website that includes the tool and the documentation. So happy to have you pass that on and include it in any fashion that is useful for you at the local level.
Thanks, Nancy, for that question. And it's great, by the way, to see so many new folks on this call. This is a great, it sounds like we're getting the word out already. And that's the first step toward getting this, tool into the hands of folks who will use it and giving them the information they need to use it effectively. Let's go on. Let's continue on with the residential example here. So we said, we incorporated a reduction associated with below market rate dwelling units. We've gotten a reduction here associated with limiting parking. Let's look at a couple of other strategies though. Let's say we wanted to expand the pedestrian network. So maybe this is a part of the municipality that is less pedestrian accessible. And so, as I said, everything should be simple, but only as simple as possible. So this is T18 here, provide pedestrian network improvements. So the way that this strategy works is you have to indicate approximately how many miles of sidewalk there currently exists in the study area, and then how much there would be with the project. And so maybe let's say that there's 3 miles of sidewalk as it stands now, and we're gonna, with the project is going to not only include sidewalks within its parcels and so forth, but also will help build out sidewalks and other ped facilities more broadly, and we'll get it up to 6 miles of sidewalks. So that might actually reduce household trips in the community by up to 5%. And especially, you know, Joanne, to your point, if this is in an area where smart service is en route, you know, there's sort of a potential nexus there. So this is an example again of a strategy whose application scale is the surrounding community and not only the project. So pretty high impact strategy there. Let's do a couple more. So let's say we want to talk about, let's go to T23, which is community-based travel planning. And so this is, again, as I say, this is sort of akin to commute trip marketing, where there's a body of research that suggests that the availability of other, like the folks are actually more or less blind to certain modes of travel if they haven't already had experience using those travel modes. And so the hope is that, you know, by providing kind of custom tailored advice and guidance and say, hey, you know, I noticed, well, you know, if you're commuting to a certain location, you know, have you considered car share, or, you know, have you considered, you know, bicycling, or, hey, did you know there's actually like a bus, or, hey, did you know Smart is opening next door, right? And so community-based travel planning seeks to connect people with the strategies that may work well for them. So let's say here that, you know, that there are 250 residences in this particular context, and of those, we feel that we're going to be able to reach 200 of them. And we can stick with the default values for the other ones. And that would suggest that the community-based travel planning might reduce VMT by close to 2%. So, you know, start knocking on those doors, right? You gotta, you know, get the word out in that respect. And let's do one other strategy as well. And let's say we should do T22C. So we're gonna actually have a scooter share. So one of the things we're going to be knocking on doors and telling people about is, hey, did you know that there are some scooters here, and you could rent one using your smartphone, and you could ride it to Bear Republic Brewing. So let's say that at the present moment, again, this is all hypothetical. Maybe there is an existing scooter share program that about 40% of people in the community can access right now, but we're going to expand it substantially such that after this measure, 85% of people are actually going to be able to access it now. And here, I did want to highlight this, right? So like, we can leave the default trip lengths in place. These again come from the Scta model. The reason I wanted to highlight the strategy though, is because not all of these strategies are created equal. You know, this scooter share program might reduce VMT only by a very small amount. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's not worthwhile, but, you know, I just do want to highlight there are some heavy hitters, and then there are some less heavy hitters. And this, again, comes straight from the literature, right? Like certain strategies are just demonstrably more powerful than others. And to understand that, you know, you can go look through, right? So there's something from MTC, and then, you know, this research paper from McQueen et al. So again, the sources, thanks for scrolling down, Chris, is a great example actually of what I mentioned before, of the sort of self-documenting tool. So we've actually now configured 5 strategies. So I think we can head to the results tab and sort of see what is the upshot, you know? Yeah, so there, let me provide a little bit of background actually about the 2 summaries that are shown. So there are 32 strategies, and then there are these 11 pots, which break it out according to the 5, you know, the land use, neighborhood design, transit, like these macro groups of which each strategy is a part. And then within each of those macro groups, some strategies apply to project VMT and some strategies apply to all community trips. And within there, also sometimes it's all project generated trips, or maybe sometimes it's only the employee commute trips, and so forth. And so what we end up seeing is these 11 pots are the first aggregation. If multiple strategies within a given pot are applied, then we apply what's called multiplicative damping, where we say, imagine you had only 2 strategies, right? And the first one cut off 50% of VMT. This is some wonder strategy. And the second one also cut off 50% of VMT. What's the aggregate effect of those 2? Well, is it 100%? Well, no, right? Because the first strategy already took off some of the group that might have been affected by the second strategy. So we would actually say the aggregate effect of those 2 is 75% and not 50%. And that's multiplicative damping. And And then, so that's the VMT reduction summary. The one section below is the high level VMT reduction summary. And what this does is it just further squishes these pots down into the 5 unique combinations of scale, which is site versus community, and VMT type, which again can be project trips, employee commute trips, all neighborhood trips, and so forth. So it looks, Chris, like maybe you still have some of the strategies configured from last time. This is kind of my...
Yeah, the employee commute trips.
Right, yeah, it's like, I don't think we had any employee strategies there.
Job density.
Right. Well, you could zero this out, but the point sort of stands. And from here, where you end up going is fairly similar as well, where you've got these macro pots and you sort of think, all right, well, if this is a residential project, then it's going to be affected by strategies that reduce all project trips. It's going to be affected by community level strategies that reduce all trips, as well as those community level strategies that reduce household trips. And so you can kind of stack those on. And again, you would go back to your workbook and say, does this suite of strategies get me where I need to go? And if so, great, no significant impact. If not, you can continue tinkering and hopefully come up with a suite of strategies that suits the project and suits the land use context of the project as well. The hope is that the VMT reduction strategies can avoid significant impacts and can actually move projects in a good direction optimally. So that that's the second example that I had prepared. I'll pause there. I see a question from Rosanna in the chat, but I also saw Nancy's hand is up. Nancy, is that your question still from before, or is this another question?
I'm good. That I need to lower that. Sorry about that.
All good. The hand thing. I mean, you saw me try to share my screen, right? Like I'm not going to profess expertise at this. Rosanna, to your question, can you go through a mixed use project example, please? How does this tool handle residential plus office or office plus retail? Yeah, so Rosanna, to your question, the results as they stand now actually shed light on that, right? Like as we have it now, we've configured strategies that are relevant to residential travel, as well as strategies that are relevant to commute trips. And so what you end up doing is it's sort of after the fact when you've got this high level summary, it's just a question of applying the appropriate reduction types to the appropriate pots of VMT. And so this is actually in the sort of supporting project worksheet, which is, I think Chris is probably planning to make some modifications. It's not quite as refined as this larger tool, but the idea there is that you actually specify what share of your project VMT comes from residential trips, or rather like household trips versus employee commute trips versus other sources. And then you have those different pots of VMT and you apply each VMT reduction type to its corresponding pot. And then that in turn allows you to make an assessment of the overall reduction effectiveness of the strategies you have selected.
I can bring that up, Drew.
Sure.
Yeah. There we go.
Yeah, great. So yeah, that's perfect. Right. So some of this, the whole top of the VMT calculation section is actually, it's just to support the analysis. In general, the idea is you got to figure out the project's home-based VMT, the project's employee commute VMT, and any other project generated VMT that there might be. And you kind of plug those in there. And then you would also typically enter what the projected population and employment of the project is in those cells exactly. Thank you, Chris. And then that from there calculates the unmitigated home-based VMT per population, as well as the work VMT per worker. And finally, also what we call total VMT per service population, which is service population is just population plus employment. So those are three common quantities that are used to set VMT impact significance thresholds. Then, so what isn't in there at all right now, because they're, as I understand, still evolving, are what are the relevant thresholds, right? And so I have cells here for each of up to 3 significance thresholds, but it's going to depend on the local jurisdiction of, which of those 3, if any, are specified in local policy. So you plug those in, and then it'll tell you whether there's a significant VMT impact based on comparing the project's VMT metrics to the local thresholds. If there is a significant VMT impact, that's actually the point in the analytical workflow at which you would go and fire up the Vmt Reduction Calculator. And then you just paste the values of those 5 macro reductions. You paste those into these 5 cells, and then they are applied automatically in rows 48 and following to the different pots of VMT. And then the project VMT per capita metrics are recalculated and compared to the thresholds again. And it tells you whether you mitigated the VMT impact. So that's where you would go. And the worksheet, the worksheet hopefully will be something helpful. And I think it might be particularly helpful for the kind of mixed use project that you have in mind, Rosanna. So thank you for that question. Does that help?
Yep, thank you.
Great. Any other questions?
I have a question. Sorry, I didn't raise my hand, but can you hear me?
Of course.
Okay. My name is Stephen Hunter. I work for the Department of Transportation and Public Works for Sonoma County. And we're already getting a lot of questions on VMT analysis from consultants and their applicants. And one of the problems is that in Sonoma County, things are generally rural. So the consultants are saying, you know, like this winery wants to build a tasting room that has, you know, X number of employees, and they're going to put in 25 parking spaces, but they have to drive, you know, 25 miles to get there. And so it's coming back as needing what the consultants are claiming to be excessive amounts of mitigation because of the high length of travel, because of the rural conditions. And I guess my question is 2 parts. From a reviewer standpoint on this, is there a strategy to review these as they come in from consultants that makes it more efficient? And also, is there anything built into this overall CEQA mandated VMT strategy that gives a break to rural businesses?
Thanks, Stephen. Let me defer on that first question, or let me rather refer to Chris as to the review process.
Yeah, Stephen, thanks for that. You know, I think one good practice, you know, when talking about mitigation and reducing VMT and trip lengths and everything, I think one benefit of this tool is, you know, if you're looking at this tool and the, you know, reduction calculations in the tool and the consultants are using it as well, if you're directing them to use that, you're at least on the same page, right? Like you're looking at the same formulas, the same reduction rates and everything like that. So, you know, I think that's a place where this tool could be useful. So help me out with the second question again. You know, I was thinking about that first piece. I think I missed the second piece.
The 2 things that we're bracing for is that, and what I've been hearing already from consultants that are concerned about this. Well, the first thing is that they weren't even sure. It sounded like that their consultants out there right now doing work for applicants weren't aware that this product, this Excel sheet, this VMT calculator was going to be available to everybody. So that's good news. I mean, we have that at least going forward, but I'm just wondering, this is kind of an internal question, but is there a quick way to review these? Or are we going to have to, like, as a reviewer, when we get an application in that has one of these VMT reports, is there a fast way to go through and back check these? Or do we have to go through every number and make sure that every percentage and ratio actually corresponds to the design? And so I'm just wondering if there's a fast way to back check this, and which might not be an easy thing to answer. I just have zero experience in it. And then the second question is that what we're getting some grumblings about is that because of the long distances that have to be traveled to go to these rural businesses, that it's kind of, they feel that the projects are being unfairly qualified within the VMT strategy, because it just takes so many lane miles, it's so long of distances just to get there. Whereas they're basically saying that VMT works better in urban environments when you're only driving a couple miles, but as soon as you get 50 parking spaces, or 50 employees going, 25-mile distances to get to and from work, it starts to not make sense. And I'm not really sure how at the Department of Transportation and Public Works we're going to deal with that.
Yeah, that's a really tricky one. And maybe, I think the first part of that question is a little bit easier, reviewing the work that comes in. One thing that I would recommend is if a consultant is using this calculator or equations from it or something similar, you can always plug in the numbers yourself, right? And make sure that they look close, say a residential, let's maybe take a job type reduction, a van pool reduction. You can plug in kind of what they're claiming and what the benefit is in the calculator just to kind of check, do a sniff check on the VMT reduction there. So that, that could be one practice that could be followed to kind of streamline that. On the, the rural projects, that's very tough. You're right. These VMT reductions are really focused on the urban areas, and in a lot or most cases don't necessarily apply that well to the rural areas. But they could inform the types of mitigations that project sponsors are proposing out in the rural areas. But it may need to be there may need to be more creativity. One thing that's happening as well is investigating VMT mitigation banking and exchanges. So our colleagues in Contra Costa and San Mateo counties have recently received a Caltrans planning grant to actually look just at that, look at VMT mitigation banking. So basically the idea there is that a project sponsor would pay offsets that could be used in other parts of the county to reduce VMT. So that work's going on right now, and we'll be watching that very closely and, see what happens. And, that type of approach could be implemented at the state, regional, or local level here in Sonoma County, or even an individual jurisdiction. So, for those really difficult projects, that may be a potential solution longer term. But in the absence of that, it's, maybe taking some information here, seeing what could be applied, and, thinking of maybe some additional approaches as well. But yeah, I definitely understand that it's going to be tougher in the rural areas for sure.
All right, thank you. That was a great answer to kind of a complicated set of questions. So
yeah.
I appreciate it.
Thanks.
And Stephen, this is Julie, just to sort of add on there, you might also, and perhaps you have done this already, but you might also be in touch with some of your peers counties who might be in somewhat similar situations. I am more familiar with Napa County, which I think similar to yours has some urbanized areas, but also a large amount of rural areas. And so the county there has grappled with how to set VMT thresholds that perhaps that make a little bit more sense in their kind of context compared to just using the sort of standardized thresholds that OPR recommended. Those OPR recommendations are just that, they are recommendations, and each lead agency does have the latitude and flexibility to set their own thresholds. It does need to have some evidence supporting them, but some jurisdictions have gone down that path of deciding to set some thresholds that are a little bit more context sensitive, perhaps you could say. So I'd be happy to share some ideas with you on that, or perhaps some contacts with some of your peers in neighboring counties would be helpful in that regard.
Thank you so much, Julie. That's great.
Thanks, Stephen, for the question, and thanks, Julie and Chris, for weighing in. Any other questions from the folks on anything we've just shown?
I think one thing I can do is share a link to to actually download the calculator and the documentation and the worksheet. So let me stop sharing so I can grab that and put that in the chat. I had it on a slide, but I think it'll be easiest just to drop that into the chat so everyone can just click on it and copy and paste easier. So, and I can plan on getting the slide deck and the recording up as well. So let me go ahead and get that. All right, so I just copied a link to the SCTA forecasting and travel data website. And if you go over onto the right-hand side, there's a SP 743 VMT section. So there's a hyperlink there where you can go to the VMT Reduction Calculator page. So you can download the tool, the worksheet, and documentation there as well. I believe we've also added a link to the CAPCOA 2020 document. And I think the OPR original guidance is linked somewhere there as well. So, and let me go ahead. Everyone has my email since I set out the meeting invite, but I'll put that up again. And Drew, is it okay if I paste your email in there as well?
By all means, thanks, Chris.
All right. Well, maybe with that, I'll go ahead and make a last call for any final questions. I know this is VMT is very complicated, right? At face value, it's pretty simple. It's how much people are driving every day. But, you're slicing and dicing VMT in different ways for different project types, right? Looking at home-based and commute VMT. And, we've heard about some of the issues in the rural areas and for, project types that don't necessarily fit into the existing guidance. So it's a learning process. So as Julie mentioned, I think collaborating with other jurisdictions on what you're doing is helpful. One thing that I have provided a link to on the SCTA website is MTC has a pretty exhaustive resource page as well. So I've provided a link there. And they're also providing some implementation training on SP 743 and VMT. So the next session on September 21st, I believe, is on mitigation. So I'll be talking a little bit about the tool there, but it'll be a little bit of a deeper dive into mitigation on a higher level at that session. So if you're not already involved in that and would like to be, please reach out and can make sure you get invited to that training. So I don't see any other questions. So I'm going to go ahead and thank everyone for coming. Thank you, Julie and Drew, for being here and all the work on this tool. And please, as you download the tool and you look through the documentation and work with it, please reach out to myself or Drew with any questions, and happy to help out in ways we can. So with that, I'll go ahead and wish everyone a nice night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Take
you.
care.
Thank you, Chris. Thanks, folks.